All right, everybody, we are back in the Fireside PM podcast, and I have Saeed Khan back for a second conversation. Welcome back, sir.
Hey, great to be back. Thanks, Tom.
You're joining from Toronto, is that right?
Toronto, yes.
All right, so we've got coast to coast. We got Toronto and Palo Alto combined for this moment. So the reason why we decided to hop on this morning was I had done a post on LinkedIn, and I'll share, where I was kind of going over what I thought were the some common reasons why product initiatives fail or struggle. And one of them is that, so I'll summarize what I was sharing, and then I'll show Saeed's comment. Then we can just talk about it. So the 5 things that I thought were worth noting are, one is like, it's very common for teams to fall in love with technology. So, obviously right now, Gen AI is kind of the big thing. Before that, machine learning, and before that, blockchain and crypto, and, it goes on and on, social, mobile, whatever the thing is at the time. And you end up, forgetting about, like, well, we're here to solve a customer problem. And PMs, we always talk about that. We always say that. But we are always seduced by these sirens. One of them is amazing technology. And it's probably a self-selected group that joins this profession. So we kind of love technology. The second one is this habit of like shipping features and shipping early and often, which is great. But that too, like sometimes the act of just launching new things can distract you from focusing on remembering what the core problem you're here to solve is. Another one is like really amazing mocks and Figmas that just look so cool, and you just kind of take it on faith that that's going to solve a problem. Another one is like heavy involvement from leadership, where we all know like this VP is super into this, or this director is super into this, or the CEO is super into this, and maybe we don't pressure test it as much as we could. And then there's inertia and sunk cost, where you're like, oh, well, we've been working on this feature forever. It's 80% done. Or, we've been talking about this forever. And so those are some things that I have brought up. And then Saeed, you made a great comment, which I'll put on the screen, about, hey, but what about the underlying factors that lead to these situations? And then you go into some examples. But let me stop talking, and Saeed, get your summary of what you were thinking when you posted that.
Yeah, so I thought the video was actually a good one. I've seen versions of all 5 things that you mentioned, but those are, if you want to call it, those are end states, right? Those are things that happen, and the question is, why do they happen? Where do some of them come from? And there's no single pathway to any one of them.
Mm-hmm.
It really varies. But I gave this example of, you mentioned feature factory, and then I said, well, how do you end up in a feature factory, right? Because that's a common pattern you see in a lot of companies, and it could be many different reasons. And I gave this one, which is that, maybe a directive from the board of directors comes to focus on larger deals because, you want to kind of increase your deal size. And so that gets translated into sales incentives to focus on larger deals, which seems logical,
Mm-hmm.
right? But then those larger deals come with individual customer requirements for custom work or something like that. And then you have to focus your engineering resources on that custom work. And then it becomes fulfilling custom orders, which is really essentially a feature factory. And so you can connect the dots, right? What started as something fairly reasonable turns into one of these dysfunctions if you're not careful.
Yeah. And I think, when the first sentence of a directive from the board to focus on deal size, like sometimes I do believe that when the directives are that prescriptive, and they're like, okay, the thing we need to do is double our deal size. Organizations are gonna do whatever they can to kind of hit that outcome that you've prescribed. But maybe what the board was trying to say is, hey, we need to increase revenue sustainably, and we think the deal size is a path to get there, but at least give like a little bit of room.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in the context of my LinkedIn comment, I was just using that as an example, but obviously it could be much more nuanced. But the point being that, like, okay, let's just say for the sake of discussion, is exactly like you described, right? It's not a prescriptive thing. We feel that you should focus on deal size as a way to increase revenue and, et cetera, et cetera. Like, sure. Like, why wouldn't you go, yeah, that's actually not a bad idea. Our deals are not as big. And then the point being that it's this chain of events that can happen, right? So when you get down to that feature factory situation, you try and look back, and not that there's a single root cause to anything, but that we didn't just arrive here suddenly. There was this series of decisions that happened over a period of time, and then we found ourselves in this state. And so, because the next question is, well, how do we get out of the state? And the answer is, well, there's going to have to be a series of decisions and actions that move you in a different direction, right? So anyway, that was really the heart of it, because I think these problems are common problems, but I think not enough time is spent really understanding how you get there and then understanding how you get out of there.
Yeah, I mean, I like your example a lot because it also highlights how kind of top-down directives do benefit from a little bit more back and forth between the directive giver and the directive receivers. So as an example, like if the board in this case said, hey, we want to focus on bigger deals, if we were writing a textbook, we would say, okay, well, the team should probably clarify, like, why do we want bigger deals? What are the assumptions behind that? What metrics are we trying to move? And, what other things do we consider, just so they can really understand the motivation behind the directive.
Yeah.
In reality, sometimes that's like not only, difficult, but almost impossible. It's like, oh, well, the SVP passed down to the VP, and then it gets to the director, and director saying to his team, like, okay, we got to go on bigger deals. If some PM is like, oh, well, I want to understand more, there may not be like a really concise, 2-page rationale for this directive. It's just something that was, decided in some meeting and then passed down multiple times.
Exactly. And again, it depends on company culture and so on. Sometimes you just say, okay, great. They want to do something, maybe there's a little bit of rationale given why. I'll give you an example. It's not a feature factory example, but I worked in a company and they were switching from on-premise perpetual licenses to subscription licenses for the same software, but they wanted to move to a subscription model. And so, the big thing was, how do you incent the sales force to sell subscriptions? Because a subscription license is not going to be as big as a perpetual license for a large deal. And so they said, okay, we will overcompensate on subscription licenses. And that's the incentive to sales reps to sell these subscription licenses. And I don't know all the details. I just know the end result. And the end result was sales reps tried to sell subscription licenses. They weren't as successful because they weren't as skilled, most likely, at selling subscription licenses as they were the perpetual licenses. And maybe customers themselves were not as kind of comfortable paying for subscription time. This was many years ago. And there was a huge shortfall in revenue because, the switchover didn't work. And the rationale was, we want to move to subscription and here's why, and long-term value and this and this. So you can go, okay. Now, I wasn't a sales rep, but I worked in the company and, I had some concerns about it as a product manager, but it was one of those kind of, series of decisions that ended up in a bad state. right? And then they have to actually pull back from that to try and recover. So I think this kind of thinking is really important, because you learn it one of two ways, right? You either learn it through analysis, which we're trying to do now, or you learn it through experience. And you'd rather not learn it through experience. it's much more painful.
Yeah, Bailey in the comments is saying she appreciates when companies champion transparency. I wish it happened more often. Sometimes it's also just hard to have that kind of transparency and back and forth. So as an example, in your case of moving from perpetual to subscription, do you think there was a venue or an appetite, or there would have been a willingness for you to say, okay, great, we're going to move to subscription. Let's discuss like all of the switching costs and kind of risks and implications? Or do you think maybe was it more like, hey, we got to do that this quarter, like this is a top-down initiative kind of thing?
I don't know. I can't. It was a long time ago. There were statements that, if you have questions, come talk to us. Our doors are open, etc. So I'm going to give them benefit of doubt and assume that yes, there was. But I frankly don't know what difference it would have made, because one of the executives, I remember saying very clearly, we did this at our last company, we did this successfully, we're going to do it here, like, okay, so it was essentially a trust me, I know what I'm doing line, or we know what we're doing line. But anyway, I'm just using it as an example to say, like, yeah, you end up in these places that you don't want to end up, and you have to kind of look back and really think through. Like, the way I recommend product managers think about this is, at each stage, ask yourself, what assumptions are you making, right? What would have to be true for this to be successful, right? Or for us to get to the next step? What would have to be true? And think, like, honestly, can that be true? What do we have to do to make that true? And that discussion has to happen with executives as well, right? Especially if it's something like a big switch to, say, subscription model, or a big change to how you want to operate. Not all companies have that sort of environment.
Yeah, especially in your example, where if a VP or someone very senior to the most of the org says, hey, we've discussed this, like we're going to make this big bet, like I've seen this work before, like let's make it happen. For most organizations, the incentive are not really set up for anyone to really push back or challenge it or try and unpack it more. I think a lot of times when I've seen those types of directives, it's really like, okay, we're doing this. You have, let's make it happen. And if someone's like, oh, well, won't that incur, some near-term switching costs, or how do we deal with this? They will be considered like, oh, you're not on board. You're not a team player.
Yeah, you're right. And quite frankly, the time to do that is not after you've made the announcement, right? The time to have that discussion and be inclusive is before you make the decision in the announcement, so that you actually get the input, right? It's like, hey, we're going to Chinese food for dinner tonight. We're going to have Chinese food for dinner tonight. What do you want for dinner? You like Chinese food? Well, guess what? We're still having Chinese food. Like, it's sort of that kind of situation. And yeah, it's not a good thing. I mean, I think executives need to understand that, the inclusion of other parts of the company is really to the benefit of the company. It's not going to create noise. It's not going to be a distraction, because you want buy-in from people. You want people to actually say, yeah, I believe in this decision. And if they've been heard, even if they don't necessarily agree, but if they've been heard, they're more likely to say, yeah, even though I don't agree, I understand where they're coming from, versus we met in secret, here's our decision, our doors are open, sort of.
Yeah.
well, when your doors should have been open, they were closed.
Right. I mean, if your doors are really open, then you would want to invite them in and ask them for their input before you make the call. And I do think this is a difficult trade-off that leaders have to make, which, has this tension between, hey, we need to be decisive, we need to be clear, we also need to deliver results and support what the business needs in a timely way, and we got to bring people along and leverage the full intelligence of the organization. And you kind of have to be okay with, like, yeah, I'm going to have a lot of conversations that may or may not change my decision, but I got to put in that time, because if I don't, the people that I rely on to help execute this are either not going to get it, or worse, feel excluded and may not even put in their kind of best efforts. But that's hard for a lot of leaders to do, because they probably have 20 other things on their list of things to do as well.
Yeah, I don't want to turn this into a dumping ground on executives or leaders, but if they've got 20 other things that they think are more important, then maybe they should reprioritize what's really important. Because I'll tell you, when that switch to, or that attempt to switch to a subscription model ended up in revenue loss, there was a lot of acrimony, and there was a lot of finger pointing, and there were a lot of people who said, hey, well, you never consulted us on this, so guess what? Like, it's on you, right?
Yeah.
Like it did not benefit the company to have that decision made that way. It really didn't. And I don't know what the sales reps felt. I don't know how they were looking at it. I mean, sales reps have a tough job. They make or lose money based on their performance, and so
Yeah.
they're going to do what's best for them, not necessarily what's best for the company. And I totally get that. Right? In theory, what's best for them is also what's best for the company. But it wasn't a good situation in the end.
Yeah. Was there agreement on, in the retrospectives, like what should have been done differently or could have been done differently, or was it one of those where everybody had a different interpretation of why it wasn't successful?
So again, it was a long time ago. I don't remember the details. I remember that there was some sort of apologetic language. I spoke to a friend of mine who didn't work at the company, but who had been through this actually at his company. And I said to him, this is what happened. We went through this process, and then we had lost revenue, etc. And the executive said, oh, we know, we've been through this before, etc., etc. And he said to me just something very blunt. He goes, are you assuming the executives didn't know that there would be a revenue loss? Because if they've been through it before, they would know there's going to be a revenue loss, because you don't switch from perpetual to subscription and not lose revenue. You build it up later, but initially you're never going to. And I just went, as soon as he said, I went, wow, you're absolutely right. So that didn't help in the sort of empathy side from me, that, yeah, you know what, they knew, and they still went ahead and did this and told us, because the implication on us, on the rest of us, was that we didn't get a bonus because company performance wasn't met. And I wasn't in sales. I didn't make the decision. I wasn't part of the decision, and yet I was getting penalized, and I was among many hundreds. I don't know how many hundreds of people. So yeah, again, who knows what the real motivation was. But anyway, let's get back to your 5 points.
Yeah. So this is a good discussion, though. So actually, one of the things that we've got here is like the seduction of technology. You and I were talking about, before we went live, about a project that I previously worked on, where, I mean, the technology was amazing. Like, basically, we were able to stitch together the the longitudinal health record of a patient from a whole variety of sources and harmonize it, and then summarize it and extract insights about the patient, and then make predictions about their future health and opportunities for interventions. And this is one of those things where, like, you do the demo and you literally get a standing ovation, and people are like, oh my God, this is the future. And one of the things that I think we learned from that experience was, yes, that technology is amazing. And at the end of the day, if the underlying incentives for either the users or their employers or the system and industry they're in are not aligned for the outcomes that you're looking for, like the technology, like it kind of has diminishing returns right after your demo ends, because people generally operate against incentives. And if they're not rewarded for using your product the way you thought it was going to be used, like they're probably not going to really embrace it. And you were saying that this is not a new story that you for you either.
No, it's not actually. I can think of several. I have one that goes way, way back, and it's actually even before I got into product management. I worked in a software company. We had this, again, really cool 3D data visualization software where we could visualize like massive amounts of data and interact with it and so on. And one of the big application areas we were focused on was portfolio risk analysis. So basically in institutional bond and instrument portfolios, and we could visualize like thousands of instruments and so on. And so at the time, and this is again a long time ago, but there was a company called Barings Bank, and Barings Bank was in the news because they had a rogue trader who had basically kind of off the books create a whole bunch of really risky positions for the company. And then once sort of everything came out, the bank had lost like, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think they had to declare bankruptcy or something. And it was like this one guy. And one of our founders was like, oh my God, like we would have detected that right away. And he called them up, got an appointment, went to wherever, Wall Street or wherever they were, had a meeting, demoed the software. And we were all excited for him to come back and hear, like, oh, this is like exactly the use case of our product. And when he came back, we asked him, he said, what happened? What happened? Everyone. It was a small startup. It was like 30 people, right? And we were just, and he was not happy. And in a nutshell, what happened was they saw the software, they agreed it would have solved the problem, and it would have helped them see these risky instruments, etc. But the problem was it made the risk too visible.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't like that, because then it put the onus on them to manage it and to make sure it didn't happen. And so like the fact that this trader could do this off the books was actually a benefit to the executives.
Oh, wow.
Because they couldn't get blamed. And we just couldn't believe it. And I'll tell you, I never saw that one founder. I don't think I ever saw him as depressed as when he came back, because like, what can you do? We have the exact solution for their problem. And yet they say, oh, your solution is actually too good. So yeah, like, there's that line, don't expect people to do something if they're paid to do something else, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a line. This is exactly the case. And your example in healthcare, I think, is exactly the case, right? If the system incents them to do X, don't expect them to do anything but X.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that reminds me, many years ago, I worked on another product, which also was technically pretty impressive, if I do say so myself. And it found a way to predict and measure the impact of display advertising, even if you didn't click on the banner ad, by creating these like matched control groups and seeing like if subsequent like behavior changed post exposure to the ad, and if it was causal because of the match controls. And we were like, oh, wow, this is so cool. Like we can see if you run the Toyota banner ads, if they are more likely to go visit a local Toyota dealership site, even if they're not connected and that kind of thing. And we showed it to a bunch of ad agencies that manage this spend. And they were initially super excited. Then when we ran the analysis, we found that many of the campaigns they ran were not generating detectable behavior changes. And they're like, oh, no. We can't, this is not good. And we were like, well, but this one worked really well. And we were kind of naive. They were like, yeah, but if I show the analysis for the one that worked well, they're going to ask me for the analysis for all the campaigns. And then what am I going to do if I run a campaign that doesn't have detectable improvements? And we were like, oh, well, wouldn't that be like test and learn and you can improve? And they're like, no. That's not how it works.
Yeah. And what's interesting about it is if you think just from a pure sort of product management discovery point of view, right? It's really important to get to that level of understanding, right? Like it's not simply, hey, can we build this? Will it have a benefit?
Mm-hmm.
It's what impact will it really have? And what does the system in which it will be used in look like, right? It's not just,
Yes.
the direct, result that you're after. There's a system that you're going to be involved in, and you have to understand that system and then adjust for that, right? Like in our case, so let's say with the Bearings Bank example, had we known that, you don't want to make the risk too visible, maybe we could have positioned it differently, or we could have, talked about it differently or something. But we didn't, right? We just said, hey, risk, we can visualize risk. We can show you the risk.
Yeah.
Not enough.
I think this is an example of a common PM pitfall, which is like most PMs often get into this place where they assume their product is a much bigger part of the user and the customer's life than it really is.
Yes.
And it's like, yes, it's a big part of your life as the PM. You're the one that's in it all day long, dog fooding, writing PRDs, triaging bugs, whatever. For most of your users, this is not a huge part of their life. And, you got to understand how it fits into the overall system. And it doesn't revolve around your product. Your product is not the sun, and they're not the stars. Like it's the other way around. You're like this little random, dot.
Yes. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And especially in enterprise software, I remember a customer I worked with, and he said almost exactly that. He said, look, yours is one of 6 products that our team uses. And you know what? Like, I love your product, but I don't spend every day in it. And you have to understand that. And this is about, I don't know, almost 20 years ago. And as a young product manager, I was like, oh, why not?
Yeah. Well, it's always great to catch up with you, Saeed, and I'm glad we were able to reconnect today, and hopefully this will be one of many conversations we'll have next year as well. Any other thoughts on the common pitfalls that we should discuss before we wrap up?
Can you just put them up again quickly? Yeah.
So let's see here. The seduction of technology, becoming a feature factory, design, executive omniscience, and sunk costs. Oh, that one's a favorite topic of mine. I don't know if you.
I was looking at that one as well, actually. Yeah, that sunk cost fallacy, right? That's kind of a big, sort of cognitive bias we have. And, you have to look at evidence, right? Like you may have put a lot into something, but none of that matters if where you are today and where you're going is not in a good place. Like killing a product is hard, especially before you launch it, let's say, or killing a feature before you launch it. But there's a joke, right? What's worse than a let's say I'll use the word feature, but what's worse than a feature that no one uses?
I don't
It's
know.
a feature that only a couple of people use.
Yes.
Because then you have to support it and maintain it and do all that, right? Like the last thing you want is to end up with something that only a few people use, because then you've got other responsibilities. So I think sunk cost fallacy, it's one where you really have to, be honest with yourselves, and you have to really say, yeah, it's better to stop investing in it now than to continue investing in it for diminishing returns. Because at some point you'll probably kill it, but boy, how much more have you spent?
Yeah.
By then.
And rarely, well, I guess it does happen sometimes, but it's not common to have a clearly failed feature. There's always some user that's going to send you great feedback that you can put a verbatim on the slide.
Yes.
Like there's always some statistic that you can pull out, like, oh, first time clicks is this much or whatever. And the thing that comes to mind for me on sunk costs is I've seen so many times where, let's say there's a reorg or there's a new leader brought in, and within 90 days they kill project number 4.
Yeah.
And no one in the legacy team really pushes back. If anything, many of the legacy team members are relieved, and there's not much of a debate about it. Which then says to me, like, wait a minute, before the new leader came in, we were all keeping this thing fueled up. It's because but none of us had deep conviction in it. And, because there had some users, and there was always, the next feature is the next iteration is going to be a really big deal, blah, blah, blah. And that's just human nature, like also with organizational talent retention and we have a great PM on that. We don't want them to be discouraged, or the engineer, the tech lead is up for promotion. We got to get this launch out. It's like, oh my God.
Yes.
So many reasons.
And the other thing, and you mentioned, like, I'll just say one story that I have on that is there was this product that somebody worked on that was championed by a certain executive. And it was horrible. It was an abject failure in so many ways, but they couldn't kill it because they'd announced it. They'd made a lot of noise about it. The executive had put their name on the line. They had actually rewarded the PM for their accomplishment, et cetera, et cetera. And it took three PMs later, and several years later, for the company to put it to rest. And it was really, a lot of it was about optics. It wasn't about doing the right thing, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, I know a lot of people are familiar with zero-based budgeting for financial plans, but you could argue zero-based budgeting for product plans makes sense too. Like, if we didn't have this feature today, would we build it? Yeah. And if the answer is no, it's like, okay, then why do we keep pouring engineers after this thing?
Yeah.
So I know it's not that simple. Sometimes there are trade-offs that one needs to make, but it's a good kind of sanity check from time to time. And if most of the stuff you're working on, you wouldn't start from scratch today, probably a good sign to do some soul searching.
Yeah. I'll just say one last thing on that point, which is, I think you have to have a connection between business and product in order to do that, right? Oftentimes there isn't a clear connection, right? That a lot of the product people are simply focused on building and delivery, and they're not focused on real success of whatever they're building, right? And so if you don't have that connection towards success, then you will never look at it from that perspective. And I think that's changing in the industry. I think there is a greater focus on product success versus product delivery, but it's still a long way to go.
Yeah. And it's asking a lot of the PMs, because we want them to deliver and launch products consistently with high quality, where we dot all the I's and cross all the T's. And we want them to be like plugged into the pulse of the customers and drive impact. And that's a lot to ask of one function.
It is, but that's the job, in my opinion, right? And you have to understand that, you have to staff for it, and you have to hire for it, etc. But if you take that out, right, and a lot of companies don't think of it that way, then you end up in feature factory or one of these other dysfunctional states. And how good is that, right? Is that what you want, or do you actually want a focus on product success and understanding how this aligns with business success, etc.?
Yeah. And this also does get into that topic of misaligned incentives, in that a PM, if they spend a lot of time talking to customers and knowing the market and developing kind of sound insights, that will generate longer term success for the roadmap. But it will not be something that gets celebrated in this quarter's like all hands or whatever, right? Like what's going to get celebrated is like, oh, we launched this thing and people love it.
I know. You're absolutely right. And that's, I think, the lonely life of product managers is, Steve Johnson, who you might have heard of, he's a former pragmatic instructor. He's a friend of mine. He has a good line, and I quote him several times. He says, sales is responsible for this year's revenue, and product management is responsible for next year's revenue. And I like the sort of metaphor, which is, we're looking to the future, but we're not going to be celebrated for next year's revenue, for doing a good job to set the company up for next year, right? Sales will get the reward for that.
Yeah.
But still, that's just part of the job. I mean, you have to understand that, and you have to accept it.
Totally. Well, Saeed, before we wrap up, how can people kind of connect with you or learn more about what you're doing? Any shout outs to resources that you work on, or places where people can find you?
Sure. I think the sort of easiest way is on LinkedIn. I'm always on LinkedIn. I mean, that's how I saw your post, Tom. So it's LinkedIn in Saeed W. Khan. I think we can put that in the notes. I think that's probably the best place. I run a meetup group for product leaders, so directors and up. There's a Slack community as well. So if you're a product leader, hit me up and I'll connect you to that. We just started a LinkedIn group for that called Product Leaders Worldwide. And I'm on Twitter, although my Twitter isn't really product related, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. So I think LinkedIn is really the best place, and I really enjoy interacting with people on LinkedIn. I find it's a good, rich environment for that.
Great. So folks should go and follow Saeed on LinkedIn, and I look forward to future conversations. And in the meantime, have a great holiday and Happy New Year.
You too, Tom. Thanks. This has been good. I'm glad to have spoken to you again. So I appreciate it.
Always fun. Take care, buddy.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. That was Saeed Khan. Some reflections before we wrap up. I think the key thing is, when you think about product management, it's so simple. It sounds so simple, like, well, I have to understand the customer, understand the problem that they have, come up with ways to solve it, launch, test, and learn, iterate. And I think what we don't talk enough about is all of the headwinds that you as a PM or a product leader or organizational leader involved with product development are going to face, that kind of conspire against you. They could be unconscious biases for technology, biases for design, biases for executive leadership, biases for conflict avoidance, biases for short-term incentives. But the list is long. And I think that's why, to Saeed's point, like, it's such an interesting job. So let me know in the comments if you've encountered other kinds of headwinds that we didn't talk about. So certainly, like we talked about 5 of them, but there's probably 50. Be curious to hear what you all think. And if any of you are PMs or PM leaders and in need of coaching or advisory services, you can feel free to reach out to me at tomleungcoaching.com. Hopefully this was useful. Do me a solid, like, share, and subscribe. See ya.